Chapter 3. Monday, November 30th, 1709, Silver Glen, Alva, Scotland. No one could really remember how long the village of Alva had existed. Originally called Alveth, it just seemed to be one of those villages that was always there, like the other hill villages, Muckett, Dollar, Tillicoultry, Menstrie and Blairlogie. Alva was dominated by the Ochil Hills, a range of ancient volcanoes that rose up from the land, magnificent and majestic. Local people would say that the natural beauty of the hills changed with the seasons, and that every day they would look different, and this Monday was no exception. Any colour of summer had long faded, and the slopes of the Ochils were reddish-brown, severe and unwelcoming. To the west the noble peak of Dumyat rose imposing and glorious, while to the northeast Craigleith looked ominous, dark and unwelcoming, its sharp protruding ridges and crags looking foreboding and dangerous. At first light Dougie Allan was already at the mine entrance, waiting patiently as the men assembled for work. The air was cold, and he rubbed his hands together vigorously to warm them as he watched the men collect their mining tools. As the 30 or so men walked past Dougie, some of them nodded in familiar, almost respectful recognition. Living in a place like Alva, it was impossible not to know or be known by those who lived there, by sight at least. However, today there was a number of new and unfamiliar faces among the group. No doubt, thought Dougie, from Dollar or Stirling, who had travelled for work. However, as he continued surveying the group, he noticed an unusual solitary figure, standing slightly apart from the others, half turned away so that Dougie could not see his face. Wondering who the stranger was, Dougie's initial impression was that he didn't seem to be the right build for a mining man, nor was he dressed for a hard day's labour, but was unusually slim with clean breeches and a crisp white shirt that looked almost new. Dougie walked forward to inquire if he required assistance. Without warning, however, the figure suddenly turned so that he was staring directly at Dougie. The man was striking, gaunt and pale-skinned, with sunken eyes and untidy jet-black hair. Feeling just a little startled by his unusual appearance, Dougie became increasingly uncomfortable as the man's gaze was disturbing and almost piercing. Breaking contact for a moment, Dougie looked around, assessing the rest of the men before returning his gaze to the stranger. The figure continued to stare, and Dougie found himself transfixed by the man's piercing bright blue eyes, which shone like sunshine shimmering on water. As the man's gaze remained fixed upon him, Dougie's discomfort turned to alarm, and he began to feel the small hairs on the back of his neck rising. Who was this man? If they had not met before, and he was sure that they had not, why did he feel so uneasy, almost as if the stranger was an adversary? Within a moment, alarm turned to fear, almost as if a cold hand had begun stroking the back of his neck. Hypnotized by the stranger's icy blue stare, it was almost as if he could see directly into Dougie's soul. Then through the distant coldness and fear, as if from far away, he thought he heard a friendly, confident voice say, "Good morning to you, Mr. Allan." After a moment of silence, the voice came again. "Mr. Allan, is all well with you, sir?" Dougie blinked. I am well." For a second, Dougie was unsure of his surroundings, and then he looked round, taking a moment to register that the stranger was gone. "Mr. Allan, sir," the voice came again. In that instant, Dougie felt that whatever happened, wherever he had been for those few moments, he was now firmly back in Alva, about to embark on a day's work. He turned around to see the two men standing just behind him. One he recognised immediately as the man he had invited into his home only 2 days earlier, Mr. James Ritchie of Hardy's of Falkirk. The other was a middle-aged man of around 40, so well dressed and such a dignified presence that he must surely be of nobility. It just took a momentary assessment for Dougie to recognise, of course, that the second man was none other than Sir John Erskine, his new employer. Richie cleared his throat and smiled. "Mr. Allan, may I introduce Sir John Erskine? He's been very keen to meet you." Erskine extended his hand, smiling warmly. Dougie nodded in acknowledgement and took a step forward and shook the man's hand, saying, "Aye, and I'm glad to meet you, sir." Dougie glanced first at Richie and then back to his new mine manager with pride and grinned. "So, Mr. Allan, what do you think of our wee operation here?" "It seems remarkable, sir," responded Dougie politely. "And I've heard that we can expect great things from you, Mr. Allan." Dougie glanced down for a moment before returning to meet Erskine's gaze. "Aye, well, sir, I'm certainly prepared to give it my best." Erskine beamed. "That's all I ask, Mr. Allan. Our initial workings seem to show that the mine in this area could be very profitable indeed, and not just for the Erskine folk, but for us all." Dougie nodded. "Aye, sir, that's what I hear too." Pausing for breath, he glanced first at Richie and then back to Erskine before continuing. "Well, if you just give me 6 months, sir, and if there's silver in there, I promise I'll get it out." Erskine stiffened his shoulders and stood tall, looking joyful. "Grand, Mr. Allan, just grand. That's just what I wanted to hear." As the two men talked, Richie, the man who had brought Dougie and Sir John Erskine together, pondered the success of this union. His mission, given only a few days earlier, had been to find a replacement for the elusive Alexander MacArthur. Although Dougie Allan had a reputation for being a hard man, he was also considered a fair man who would give 100%. MacArthur's unexpected disappearance had caused something of a furore between Erskine and William Hardy. Accusations of time-wasting, threats and contract cancellations were forced Hardy to break procedure and send Richie to personally negotiate with Allan. Since Richie's successful return, however, Hardy seemed like a different man, relaxed, almost jovial. Suddenly realizing that he'd been staring at the two men with a broad grin on his face, Richie blinked and brought himself back to the moment. "Do you have everything that you need, Mr. Allan? Do you have enough men?" Dougie lifted his gaze. "Aye, Mr. Richie, I believe all the men are here, but a couple of mere horses wouldn't go amiss." Richie nodded warmly. "Aye, Mr. Allan, I'll see you have them as soon as possible." Keen to get the men to start work, Dougie glanced at both men for a final time. "Mr. Erskine, Mr. Richie, sir, if you'll give me leave, I'd best be getting on. It's been an honour talking with you." Smiling, Erskine extended his hand and shook Dougie's. "Likewise, Mr. Allan, likewise." Dougie acknowledged the two men with a single nod of his head and turned and walked away to where the workers were mustering. Dougie saw a number of familiar faces, the McRae brothers from Menstrie, Robert and Stuart. Fine, strong lads, both of them, who had worked with him the previous year in Alloa. William Donaldson from Mackie's Farm and Fraser McAndrew from Fish Cross. The other 30 or so men Dougie knew only by sight. As he looked at the group, Dougie searched for the gaunt stranger who had held his attention with such intensity just a few minutes earlier. Had the man left, deciding not to join the workforce, or had the moments been some kind of waking nightmare? For a moment, standing with the group, Dougie questioned his own memory and wondered if the man had actually been there at all. With Erskine and Richie watching, Dougie didn't want to give the impression that he was hesitant or had somehow lost his mind even before the job had started. So taking a deep breath, he decided to focus his thoughts on the task at hand rather than letting his imagination run wild. Standing in front of the men, Dougie cleared his throat. "Morning, lads. It's great to see you all here." The group were chatting amongst themselves, but fell silent as Dougie continued. "Today is a historic day for Alva. It isn't every day that a good seam of silver is found. You lads have been chosen because I ken you'll get the job well done." Murmurs rippled throughout the group and heads nodded in agreement. "Now there's no doubt that it's going to be hard work, but I'll tell you, if this shaft's got half the silver in it it's supposed to have down there, then we'll all have a job that lasts for life." Dougie's expression turned serious, and he paused to ensure that everyone had absorbed the words, and then continued. "Some of you I ken, and some of you I don't. I have a few rules for you. In the first part, nae trickery or thieving. Any man I find stealing will be held to account. Do you hear me?" The murmurs increased and heads nodded. "And in the second part, you'll get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. And the last part, you're nae to take any stupid risks. I don't want to be the man to tell your wives that you're nae coming home. So lads, are we all in agreement?" A unanimous aye rang out in a chorus of accord. "Then let's get to it." For a moment the swift rush of activity and noise overwhelmed Dougie as voices were raised, tools were picked up, and the day's work began. By late afternoon, Dougie had made a decision for the men to lay down tools for the day, and having made sure that the site was cleared, he watched as the last few bodies dispersed on their way homeward, walking through the fading light. When he had done his final check, although the daylight was almost gone, Dougie took the opportunity to walk through the glen that he loved so much. It was in the evening twilight that he discovered a profound sense of peace that seemed to descend upon him in the cool air. He felt that in these moments he could put aside any thoughts or troubles of the day. Walking down the hill towards home, Dougie could just make out the silhouette of two men loitering by the side of the path, ahead as if they were waiting for someone. One of the men was sitting on a dry stone wall that gave a boundary to the path, while the other was just standing a short distance away. As he drew near, Dougie recognised the men were the two McRae brothers. "All right, lads, are you nae going home for your supper?" Stuart, the taller of the two, jumped down from the wall and went to stand by his brother. Good evening, Mr. Allan. We were wanting to talk with you for a moment." Dougie nodded. "Well, aye, lads. You may talk if you wish. Is there something troubling you?" The two men glanced at each other uneasily, almost as if to dare the other to speak first. In the end, it was Stuart, the taller and elder of the two brothers, who broke the silence. "Well, ye ken, Mr. Allan, the men have been talking." "Oh, aye, and what kind of talk would that be then?" responded Dougie, curious as to what the rumours might be going round the mining crew, and wondering if there had been any talk about the gaunt stranger. "A talk at Alexander MacArthur." As soon as Dougie heard the name, he knew what was coming. "Och, lads, canna be guessing about such things." "It's nae guessing, Mr. Allan. The men were talking. And what did they say, Stuart?" The elder lad looked uncomfortably at his brother for moral support, but none seemed to be forthcoming. "They say, well, Mr. Allan, they say that he just disappeared, in there, inside the mine." Dougie sighed and nodded his head. "Och, lads, I'm going to be honest with you. The truth is we don't ken what happened to MacArthur. For all we know, the man was an idiot. Perhaps he got drunk one night and fell in the glen, or perhaps he was taken away by the fairy folk, eh?" The brothers looked at each other and smirked as the seeds of doubt began to take root. "Aye, lads, talking about wild, stupid rumours isn't going to put food on the tables, is it? And I'm sure the truth will eventually come out. But for now, we all have a job to do, aye?" A final glance at his brother, and then Stuart turned his gaze downward and gave a sigh. "Aye, you're right, Mr. Allan. I'm sorry." As the lad apologised, Dougie realised that his tone might have sounded a little harsh and critical when all the young men were looking for was a little reassurance. He softened his tone and continued. "Och, look, lads, there's nothing to be sorry for. Don't worry yourselves, for I'm sure we'll find the truth soon enough. Now, get yourselves home before you'll miss your supper." As Dougie turned homeward once more, the two young men turned to leave. "Thank you, Mr. Allan. We'll be there in the morning." "All right, lads. Good night." And with those words, Dougie watched as the brothers turned and walked away into the darkness, before he himself continued his journey homeward.